Welcome to the PR podcast. My name is Dominika Tasarz-Sochacka and I will be your host for this episode. Our guest today is someone who has spent more than 25 years at the intersection of technology and community, answering one big question: how do I foster a vibrant developer community around this project? Arun Gupta has built developer ecosystems from the ground up at companies like Apple, Amazon, Intel, Red Hat, Couchbase, and Oracle. Arun has held leadership roles at the very heart of open source. He served as board chair of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and today he's chair of the OpenSSF, leading the charge of open source security adoption and funding. He published 7 books and more than 2,000 technical blogs, helping guide countless developers on their journeys. On a personal note, I've seen Arun's journey over my past 15 years in the Java industry. We crossed paths a few times, especially back in the Glassfish days, and it's great to finally sit down for a deeper conversation on a subject we're both passionate about. I've learned a lot from Arun over the years, and I'm excited that he's sharing his wisdom in ways that others can also benefit from. In our conversation, we'll be diving into his latest book titled Fostering Open Source Culture, exploring what it really takes for businesses and individuals to thrive in the open source world. You'll find links to the book in this episode description so you can grab your copy. So let's get started. Why open source is the future of business innovation? A conversation with Arun Gupta. Welcome, Arun. Thank you very much for joining me for the PR podcast. I'm really honored to have you here. And it's been a while since last time I saw you.
It has been a while indeed, and I'm very, very happy and grateful to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So obviously the main reason for me really wanting to talk to you and share what you've got to say with the PR community is your book. So you've published a book. I don't know, when was it published exactly? It's been a couple of months now.
Actually, December of last year. So it's been a while.
December of last year. So still
it's a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, so still not a year ago. So I got hold of it about two months ago, I think, and it's been incredibly useful and it's incredibly reassuring as well. So I wanted to make sure that those people in our community that are not necessarily aware but are very much not only interested but actually partaking in open source technology are aware of it, and because I think they might find it useful as well. So the book is called Fostering Open Source Culture. And what I wanted to sort of start with, so you do end your book with your own open source journey. That's at the end of it. But I would like to begin with it. So what experiences led you to writing this book?
Yeah, I think the story really goes back during my Sun Microsystems days when we were taking Glassfish, the open source application server now, from closed source to open source. And as we were taking that application server onto that open source journey, each and every conversation that we were having in a hallway, hey, somebody in the community, like, where is this community? No, you put it on a dev at glassfish.java.net, put it out there so that everybody understands it. So that entire cultural change, the way we did, write blogs, do community events, participate in conferences, answer in Stack Overflow, forums, etc. So that entire cultural change was very much fundamental part of how I grew up in the Sun days and carried that with until 2013 while I was driving all the Java evangelism efforts. And I realized that as I was going on a journey from Sun to Oracle to Red Hat to Couchbase, then to Amazon, Apple, and Intel, pretty much the process is exactly the same. That open source culture needs like an executive sponsor. You need those internal processes. Everything kind of needs to lock down. And I was listening to a podcast this morning, and it instantly connected with me. It was a bit poetic and a bit like plumbing. Poetic in the sense that, oh, you know what? This is all nice and fun stuff that we need to do this aspirational. But in order for that poem to work, we need to have the plumbing in place. And so I realized that I was literally having the same poem across all the companies, but creating a similar plumbing. So I thought, you know what? Let's scale it. Let's share it with a broader set of communities. And that's sort of how the book came about to be.
Great. And you've had a long journey, and like you said, you've been working for many different companies that actually applied the same principles and the same strategy, and it worked. So this is exactly why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I think it's an interesting view that the book is not necessarily talking about what we see at the conferences. So it's not necessarily talking to the contributors and people that are actually already working with open source, but it's on the other side. How do we start the open source culture within the businesses? So coming from the inside out rather than other way around, which is what I often deal with. So if I go to conferences, I talk to the end users, to those that bring the culture to the company. But what if it happens organically from the inside? This is a really interesting approach, and this is exactly how it should happen, really. So in your view, what is the biggest driver for adopting open source in those large established businesses like the ones that you have experience in?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about it, there are several drivers, multiple drivers. Whenever I talk to a company, whenever I think about a company, my question is, if you're trying to adopt open source, my question is why? I always ask that why. That is super important. And the why could widely differ for each company, which is perfectly all right. Some of the whys that I've seen: faster innovation, for example. They want to be able to innovate faster. And by that, what I mean is my company has strategized on containers, and I want to do the orchestration of containers. I'm not going to write a brand new Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is already set up as an open source standard. I'm just going to leverage Kubernetes, and I'm going to scale on that and innovate what my customer believes in. So that way it gives me a faster innovation. The other reason that I see is sustainable code base, because Kubernetes is maintained. I'm going to go dig into the example of Kubernetes because it's one of the most successful open source projects, but it's maintained by 80,000 developers across 5,000 companies. Maintainer burnouts, if you are doing an open source project, is a real deal. And you can't be the only person maintaining the project day in, day out, unless you are Linus, because then you are the Linus Torvalds. But for humans like us, we need a break. We get burnout. We are squishy. We have feelings. So in that sense, it makes it a code base sustainable, and it makes the code base diverse, because you want your code base to be leveraged by everybody in the universe. So with these 80,000 people coming from around the world, makes it diverse. That each developer is really scratching their own itch. A big driver for using open source is cost savings. That, I don't have to put 80,000 developers to create a Kubernetes. I can just put 2 maintainers up there into the project and leverage all the fun benefits, and yet kind of maintain my thought leadership over there. So it's a massive cost savings for me. No vendor lock-in, again, is a big one. That, sure, I'm using Kubernetes, but if I'm writing the Helm chart, the same Helm chart would work on Kubernetes no matter where the Kubernetes is running, which of the hyperscalers is picking it up. The customization and the flexibility of it matters a lot. If you go with a closed source, the customization and the flexibility of what can you do is only defined by that one vendor. As opposed to in an open source project, you can jump into the middle of the project and start kind of creating that pluggability layer, and you can bring your own plugins if you want to. Another big one really is talent pipeline. So because I've worked at companies where open source project has been very, very critical for them. Now, as you put your 2 maintainers out into the project, you build your thought leadership into the project, and you say, you know what, this project is becoming more critical for me now. And as the project is becoming more critical, you want to hire more people for that. So those people who are out in the project, because of their social network, they can help you identify, build a talent pipeline. So several reasons that I've seen. The key element that you have to think about it is, what is your why? If you want to start with an open source project, you want to invest into an open source effort, what is your why? Highly, highly recommend to document it so that it's clear, because I've worked at companies, depending upon which team you're talking to, they have different whys, and which is okay. It doesn't have to be a company-wide why. But if a team wants to invest into open source, at least within the team, there should be clear KPIs that why are we investing into open source? And if it changes, it's okay, but at least you have clarity on what it needs to look like.
Great. So yeah, the list is long, and I guess we could probably go on and list some more reasons. But this leads me to sort of my next question, but also a thing that again pops up in lots of open source events, where for those events, a lot of people that attend and listen, we are already sold on open source. Like we know the meaning, we know the importance, we know why, we've got those whys sorted. But what is quite often being mentioned is how open source industry or outside of the industry, that there's this unfortunate lack of knowledge among the tech decision makers that open source technology is actually already a major part of their ecosystem very often. And do you have any ideas on how we as project owners, project creators or contributors can make those decision makers maybe more aware of the open source presence and importance and growth if they see if the why is there?
Yeah, no, I think it's super important actually. Uh, the way I believe it is, you have a chief technology officer in a company that is responsible for technology in the company. There is a chief financial officer that is responsible for the finances of the company, chief operations officer. Just like that, there's got to be a chief open source officer. And the role for that person is really, and the reason I'm saying it's a C staff role is because so that is very well aligned, or maybe reporting to the CTO, because think about Kubernetes, Linux, Python, Postgres, Kafka, Java. These aren't fringe tools. They're the backbone of a modern infrastructure. The irony is that open source has become so reliable and invisible that people forget it's there. I would challenge, for the CTOs that, hey, think about doing an open source free day, open source free hour. That in an hour, we're not going to use any open source project. I'm telling you, all modern IT is going to come to a halt completely. There is no single company that's going to be able to do this. Now, the way to make them more aware is, you trace dependencies early. Map out what are the open source components inside your stack and show executives what workloads would grind to a halt if these projects vanished. So making a bold statement that, hey, 95% of our cloud workloads run on open source software maintained by a dozen volunteers. Boom, that just draws a picture. At 95, really? I did not. Making those statements, whatever those numbers are for you, is important. Point out how much commercial software, cloud software, and SaaS offerings are built on top of open source foundations. You may be using Databricks, you may be running on AWS, but the fact that AWS builds on top of open source, the fact that you're running PostgreSQL on open source, the fact that Postgres is open source and the control plane of AWS, not open source, but built on open source technologies, goes a long way. So it reframes open source not as free tools, but as industry infrastructure. And then the last part is to kind of highlight the business risk, that position awareness not just as gratitude, but as risk management, security, supply chain integrity, talent attraction, everything hinge on healthy open source projects. So if we rely upon that open source projects, and now you want to make a change into that open source project, you want to be part of the community. If you're not part of the community, then the project will go in a direction that is not aligned with your business. That's a risk. That's a business risk. So that's why identifying the stack, putting the right maintainers in those right projects that are critical for you, making sure you support them is super important.
And that leads me nicely to a next question about legacy mindset. So you mentioned that term in the book. Can you explain what you mean by that and how it may hold companies back from adopting open source?
Yeah. I mean, lots of companies have been extremely successful doing things in a very proprietary, closed source manner. And if you walk into those companies, it's like, we have been successful. What are you bringing this open source thing to us? Like, what is this hippie mindset? So it has changed significantly, I would say, in the last decade or so. But gosh, I've worked at companies where open source is still frowned upon. Not so much. But the point is, when you talk to the execs, I mean, I won't name the company, but I remember in one of the companies that I worked at, we went to the top executive. We said, oh, you know what? we need to change the open source processes, simplify it, because if we don't, then these maintainers of Kubernetes are going to leave. And the question he asks is, how many maintainers? It's okay. Let them go. We are a cool company. They want to work for us. I said, no, it doesn't work like that's exactly the legacy mindset that I'm talking about. That, oh, we are successful, we are popular, we are well known, people want to work for us, without recognizing that open source community doesn't work for that way. So if a person leaves a company because of a lack of open source culture, of a thriving mindset over there, they're going to tell that to everybody else in the open source world, and nobody from the open source world would like to work over there. So that's the legacy mindset that the companies need to get over. There is a strong cultural inertia in terms of which holds the company back. Oh, the culture is very important here. So I would say Microsoft and Amazon, frankly, are the two great examples of turnaround. I joined Amazon back in 2017, and I remember writing the 6-pager for Amazon to join CNCF. And I remember doing multiple discussions with the executive management over there that why the culture needs to change, why we need to contribute more to the open source projects. And Amazon has definitely come a long way, particularly with Nitya and David Nelly kind of at the helm over there. They're driving a fantastic ship over there. Microsoft, of course, we have seen was Satya Nadella kind of driving the ship over there. But there are other companies where I've been part of where open source is still on the fringe. Here and there something is happening, but nothing strategic. And the lack of leadership is clearly evident in that sense. So the fostering an open source culture in such a company means really helping it recognize that its long-term success depends not just on what it can take from the open source community, but on what it can give back. The reciprocity, in my opinion, is the foundation of sustainable innovation. And that's what allows the company to innovate faster, because adaptability to the latest programming paradigm, latest industry trends. If you're gonna stay set in your legacy mindset, guess what? You're gonna become a legacy company.
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you for using specific examples as well. It's really much easier to imagine and apply things when you actually talk about real life scenarios that most of us know. And in that context, because there's a lot of misconception, I think, about how open source is often called free software. But obviously, when you think about big company investing in free software, there could be a question, why would we even invest in that? What's in it for us? Other than obviously all of the things that we've already said. So, and again, you are talking in the book about those concepts of corporate altruism and enlightened self-interest. So can you explain the difference between these two concepts, what they mean, and when it comes to adopting open source strategy for those big companies that obviously will be thinking of where is my investment going? Why should I invest?
Yeah. Well, first thing you got to think about is when you are investing in an open source project, or when you are using an open source project, it's not as a free beer. It's like a free puppy. That's an important distinction to make. Free beer, you get it, you drink it, you're done. Free puppy, sure, somebody can give you a puppy, but you got to take care of it. You got to take it for walks. You got to teach it. You got to feed it. It's like a family member. So in that sense, it's a lot of nurturing, fostering, caring that is required to be done in order to keep the puppy happy. So that's an important element. Coming to your corporate altruism, it refers to a company's voluntary commitment to contribute resources, expertise, funding, whatever, to open source projects without expecting immediate or direct financial benefits. Very rare. There are examples. This commitment may include code contributions. You have internal tools that you can open source, financial support for open source initiatives, community engagement, all sorts of fun stuff. It's really driven by a desire to give back to the community, promote more transparency, and support the growth of a healthy and vibrant ecosystem, even if it may not directly serve companies' interests. Bloomberg is a classic example. So, for example, philanthropy is one of their core philosophies, and Bloomberg is one of the case studies in the book. And there they talk about how exactly is not necessarily corporate altruism, but how it really ties back to for their core philosophy to be able to contribute back, because to them, contributing to open source is philanthropy. Now, the second case, which is a bit more pragmatic, is enlightened self-interest. That a lot of the corporates might have a better connection. Now, this refers to the idea where companies can benefit themselves while also contributing to the common good of the open source community. So, for example, you are relying upon Kubernetes, OpenJDK, Python, Kafka, pick a project of your open source. So you can see that such open source initiatives align with my company's long-term strategic goals. I want Java to stay healthy, so I'm going to contribute to OpenJDK, and ultimately it will yield a positive outcome for the company. And while I'm also advancing the technology, because the fact that I'm advancing the community out in the open, that means I am going to get feedback from a wider set of community. The open source project is going to move forward, and I'm going to get benefits. That's sort of my enlightened self-interest. The whole idea here is by aligning the interest with the business interests with the principles of openness, collaboration, and community-driven development, both short-term gains of the company and the long-term sustainability of the project comes into the picture. So I think in that sense, think about between corporate altruism versus enlightened self-interest, what matters to you. And it kind of goes back to the why. Why do you want to contribute to open source? I think it all ties back to why to me.
Yeah. And then, and as when you define the whys, it sort of may just come out on its own. So that's the best place to start. So, and that's interesting because I wanted to ask, how can a company that really has never engaged, at least consciously, in open source, so haven't really done any specific strategy around being an open source or fostering open source culture, how they can begin participating in projects? Where is the best place to start?
Yeah, well, the way you want to think about this is, I would like to hear a company that is not using any open source project, first of all. And I've not heard any company so far in all these years, right? So if you are using an open source project, then you likely have a legal team or an open source program office or something of that nature, essentially, that is ensuring that you are using the software in a legally compliant manner, right? That's a legal requirement. So you can't really get away with it. So if you're using any part of software, which everybody is using some, so you have some sort of effort already happening within the team. Now, the effort would be, how do you make that bigger? Because that open source program office is really to foster that open source culture within the company. And that is really responsible for open source advocacy within the company as well. So if you want to start with a project and start participating in a project, two different ways to think about it. One of them is a corporate aligned project. So let's say you are a company that is using Java. Say, you know what? Okay, Java is critical. Just hang out in the community. Just see who the key players are. Just engage with them so that you are aware of what are the latest features coming out. So it's more like an observer role or a lurker role. You don't participate at all, but you are allowed to hang out in the community, understand what the discussions are going on. And the moment there is something that triggers you that, oh, this is aligned with our business interest, bring that insight. And that's about it. So that's the observer role. Usually I recommend crawl, walk, run strategy, but in this case, I'm saying observe, then crawl, walk, and run strategy. So you observe which project matter to you. And these are still business aligned projects. So OpenJDK is critical to you, Python is critical to you, whatever, right? There are millions of open source projects. Think which project is critical to you, start observing that. Usually they have their Discord channel, usually they have their GitHub issues or some sort of a Slack. Just observe, depending upon the scale of the project might have a working group or a special interest group, and you kind of start hanging out over there. You start learning who the leaderships are, what kind of issues are being discussed, how the agenda is being prepared. So just attend a couple of meetings and you get a good feel for it. And then sometimes you need to get a permission from your company that can I participate in there? And then maybe you start with the crawl process of it. And the crawl could be, you could be like, okay, I could be the scribe for the meeting. As simple as that, right? or maybe for the first couple of meetings, you kind of shoulder somebody so that you understand how the scribe works. And then, yeah, this is simple. I can do it. I'm going to volunteer myself for scribe. Or you triage through the GitHub issues, see what issues matter to you. You start leaving minor comments on the issues that, okay, hey, I saw this code could be improved like this, and boom, you leave a comment. And again, not directly relevant to your project, but that's sort of how you build the trust in the project. So that's sort of the crawl strategy. Or a big favor to the project really is, if you're using the project in your company, submit a talk. I know these projects crave for an end user talk. So let's say you are an end user company, and in the end user company, you are using, say, OpenJDK or whatever project comes to your mind. And you say, hey, I'm going to talk about how we use OpenJDK. And boom, I know projects like that, they crave for how end users are. So submit a talk, give a talk at your local meetup. You don't have to travel. Sometimes travel could be a concern. I mean, there are lots of virtual conferences, show up on a podcast. So lots of different ways by which you can crawl. Then maybe you want to start walking. Then you say, aha, here is this new feature coming in, and maybe I'm going to start contributing to that feature. Again, make sure that your company is okay with that. So you start contributing to the feature. And then eventually you could become a lead, a maintainer, or committer, or whatever, different levels of the project. So rise up the governance ladder. So there's really no limit to it. The beauty of open source is it's not just restricted to technical leadership. There are lots and lots of non-technical leadership. Code is only 20% of the work.
That's right. This is what I preach as a non-technical person in this, because I can't contribute code, but there's so many other ways, right?
Exactly. So I think that's the beauty of it. Code is only 20% of the work, but doing this, what you're doing, in the open source community, recording a podcast, hosting an event, doing a call for papers, or writing a blog, or writing tests, or fixing docs, or localizing them. There are millions of ways by which you can help. So in that sense, think about what excites you. And the usual phrase that we use in open source is scratch your own itch. That this is what I'm good at, this is what I like, and this is how I'm going to go about it. And this can help. So that's more on the business side of the house. Now, on the personal side of the house, a lot of us like to get engaged on a personal side. That, okay, my business is completely non-cloud native, but I want to be engaged with the cloud native community. So again, get a permission, whatever the rules in your companies are. Once you have that permission, then you start engaging in the cloud native community. Figure out where in the cloud native community would you like to engage. Is it the developer experience working group? There are so many wide variety of working groups all across cloud native community that you can get engaged over there. Is it that you want to be part of KubeCon, which is the premier cloud native conference? There are thousands of papers submitted, and they can only select like handful of them, not a handful, but of a small percentage of them. So you may want to be part of the KubeCon committee, who's selecting papers. So reach out to the conference chairs essentially that, hey, I would like to be part of it. They always need help. Or you say, hey, I'm gonna go participate in my local cloud native meetup, or I'm gonna start observing the Reddit channel, and if I have something to contribute, I'll contribute over there, or I'll ask a question. So again, a wide variety of ways, whether it's aligned with your business, whether it's aligned with your personal interests. Think about what you want to do. Observe, crawl, walk, run would be my recommendation.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for mentioning, different types of contribution, because it's really important for individuals to realize there's so many different ways to contribute, and just make it happen and make things grow and be that champion of open source culture within your company. So you don't have to be a hardcore developer to do that, or you can be and still do other types of contributions. And
100%.
Yeah.
And by the way, if I were to dig onto that, there is a appendix in the book that talks about 10 non-code ways to contribute to open source, and we highlighted some of those. So for example, documentation is an easy one. That, hey, English is my major language, my first language, and I'm going to just go through grammatical check of the docs itself, or I'm going to make sure the sentences are clearly written. Or I am in Brazil or Japan or China, and I'm going to start localizing that language. Or I'm going to test the project. There are tests written over there. I'm going to just literally follow the instructions and see if they work or if there are breaks in there. I'm a design expert, so I can give feedback from the developer experience perspective. Hey, your first Hello World example is broken, or it doesn't work, or I follow the instructions, and here is how you can simplify it. Community building, we talked about. Project management, is very essential for open source projects because it really helps you maintain order, ensure quality, and foster collaboration. Marketing and promotion. You're a legal expert, so help the project set up your CLA or DCO, whatever you want to do that, or financial support. That okay, lots of projects need sponsorship, so there are efforts like Open Collective or GitHub sponsorships. So lots of different ways by which you can contribute to an open source project. Think about what excites you, and that how that aligns with the need of the project.
Yeah, I always say play to your strengths. What are your strengths? What is, like you said, what excites you, and it shows how community based it is, how many different aspects need to be covered for it to work. So we do need different contributions, different skills to be contributed to the projects for it to work. So yeah, there's so many options. And as we are on this sort of personal how we can personally contribute, are there any internal, and I'm specifically thinking internal events or programs, because you're talking about those in the book, any that you've seen or organized or maybe actually took part in yourself that you've noticed were especially effective at cultivating this open source culture within the company itself?
Yeah, several over the years. And we go back to the Glassfish days, as a matter of fact. We organized several Java EE hackathons, Glassfish hackathons, all sorts of fun stuff we did over there. That really, and we did global hackathons. Adopt a JSR. That's the program we ran. Gosh, you remember that, right? We ran that many years ago.
Yes,
and
that's right.
As part of Java E7, we had about good 10 to 12 specs. We had different Java user groups adopting those different JSRs and help us write examples, test cases, promote that spec, and that sort of stuff. So we really did that as a global scale. And that really allowed us to kind of spread the project. And it's not just internal, it's literally around the world that every different groups were picking up and on how to build that open source culture, get excitement created in a project. At the internal level, you can pretty much apply the same process, right? So for example, within Sun, we ran multiple Glassfish hackathons internally, brought developers from around the world who would hack on the project, build some cool stuff over there. At one point, we created some fancy competition around plugins. That, hey, here's a plugin architecture. What kind of plugin can you create for the Glassfish Enterprise Console, kind of a thing? At Amazon, we built multiple internal workshops because Kubernetes was new back in 2017. So we were running Kubernetes workshops at Amazon. At Apple, when I was there, we ran the first internal Apple Kubernetes Summit. And I joined in February, and I think we ran the summit in September. And gosh, there were 1,000 people from all across Apple who showed up at that summit.
Amazing.
They were all working on Kubernetes, Apple Maps, Siri, all sorts of folks using all sorts of fancy stuff. And they all showed up over there and they were like, oh, I did not know you were working on this case. Oh, I did not know you were working on this technology. So it really allowed us to kind of break those silos, break those walls between the different orgs that, hey, end of the day, we are all working on Kubernetes within the same company. So let's talk more, let's exchange more. And maybe the problem that you are facing, we have solved it and vice versa. So that kind of builds that open source culture across the company. So in that sense, that was very helpful. That was very influential, and really enjoyed that process. So I would say internal summits are a big one. At Intel, we did this Open Ecosystem Summit. We had about 2,500 people that showed up around the world. We ran it across 3 different regions, Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America. And we ran 3 different summits. And literally people from around the world were joining at different events on what that needs to look like. So I think in that sense, internal summits to me are the biggest bang for the buck. Then you can do hackathons, which are targeted sprints. So you bring the developers together. You say, here's what we want to work on together. here is a problem that we have identified. That goes a long way. You can also set up an inner source practice, for example. And inner source was big because at Intel, we have thousands of repos as part of the inner source repo. And the whole idea over there was you are working on a problem of which 80% of this has already been solved. You only need 20% differentiation. Why create 100%? Leverage an existing one and build on top of that. So just do the 20%. So there's an inner source repo with a very nice topology. You search through that topology, you get the detail, and then you're ready to roll. So that inner source, again, is a big practice, which really breaks down that, which fosters that open source culture. So I would say those are some of the elements that we have seen, hackathons, summits, inner source, that really helps you go a long way on that.
And then, when you expand on this, for decision makers and if there are teams, like people teams within companies, that also fosters just collaboration between people within the company. So even taking out all of the open source culture aspects, there's so many benefits to doing all of these that you've just mentioned. So collaboration between teammates. There's also just training. People learn from each other. There's this exchange of knowledge and exchange of experiences. So there's only benefits in that.
Correct. And the idea is not only just doing those summits, not only doing those hackathons, but making sure the executives understand the value out of it. So really crafting out those stories. And so, for example, when we did these internal summits, we would send out internal reports to the executive management that, hey, folks, this is what we did. These are the stories that come out of it. Here are the KPIs that were set up. We thought there'll be 2,000 people, but there were 2,500 people over there. And here are some of the quotes that came out that these two teams were never talking to each other, as in they were not even aware of each other. But now, because of this summit, here are so many interesting conversations we have enabled and really bringing that open source culture. Because if you think about it at a global scale, that's what open source culture is about, right? Transparency, collaboration, all of that integration work with each other. So once you understand, build that culture inside the company, the likelihood of this happening out in the open source is a lot higher.
That's right. So on the educational and sort of this knowledge exchange topic, let's explore another concept that you talk about in the book, which you called intellectual knowledge. And what does it mean in the context of open source community specifically, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so the concept, kind of contrasts with intellectual property, right? For a closed source project, they have an intellectual property. That's why it's closed source. And they say, we provide all the documentation, we provide all the guidance, we provide all the blueprints, et cetera, et cetera. Intellectual knowledge is when the project is open source, the knowledge that is spread all across the universe, whether it's in the code itself or in the Stack Overflow or in the Slack or in the GitHub issues, the fact that somebody has filed an issue. So before you file an issue, projects strongly recommend that, okay, take a look at it. If somebody has filed a similar issue, so then you start reading their issue that, you know what, it's very similar to my symptom. So instead of filing the issue all over, you can just give a thumbs up or a +1. And that way you're observing the issue. There are a lot of failures. There are a lot of horror stories. There are a lot of success stories, conference talks, etc., that are given. So that, to me, that vast expanse of knowledge is called intellectual knowledge, right? Because that you really build upon that intellectual knowledge, in terms of how this needs to pan out. So the skills, the patterns, the problem-solving approaches, by working with open source, this is very unlike IP, intellectual property, as we were talking about. Knowledge isn't bound by a license. And the other advantage of this is, once you know how to operationalize Kubernetes or how to optimize a Linux kernel, you can actually carry that expertise with you across companies and projects, right? So
that's it.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'll give you my personal example. I'm a CNCF governing board rep through Amazon. Then I moved over to Apple, and the governing board responsibilities from the existing member rep transferred over to me. I continued to be the governing board rep. Then from there, I moved to Intel, and I continued to be the governing board rep. So the the thread across these beads is really governing board rep, because that skill is independent of which company am I working at. So in that sense, that allows you to carry progress in your career.
Yeah, and that's really good call out to any individuals that are wondering, is what's in it for me? Should I take part in open source projects? That's it. That it's, you, like you said, you can carry it forward. You can it
I'll
just
give you another
grows your
example.
skill set, no
Oh,
matter
100%.
where you are.
Yeah, I'll give you another example. Like, there's a very dear friend of mine, Dims, Davanam Srinivas. He's on the CNCF TOC, and I've known him for 20 years. Dims was part of VMware, part of CNCF. From there, he went on to Amazon, still part of CNCF TOC. And then from there, now he has joined NVIDIA. He's working on Kubernetes all along. So there are hundreds of such examples, people who have continued to work on an open source project. That's the intellectual knowledge that they have built, because that skill is really transferable across multiple companies. And as a matter of fact, companies value you for that skill.
That's right. Yeah, and I think we need to talk about it more and make it very obvious that that's how your contribution and your part in open source works for you. It's a benefit for you as well as the projects that you are contributing to.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't really have these days, we can't have the technology podcast or conversation without mentioning AI, right? Needs to be said. So how do you think AI is changing open source culture? Is it at all, or could it change it? And what are there any new opportunities or challenges that you think it might bring?
Yeah, I mean, AI is as disruptive as maybe the introduction of computers or introduction of internet. Cloud and mobile were game changing in terms of operational aspect of it, but this is disruptive. This is fundamentally disruptive. Is getting into each and every phase of our life. The way I listen to music, the way I search for things. I've not gone to Google for many months. I don't do Google searching at all. And they're auto suggestions. Once in a while I go over there, the auto suggestions are super crap. So I just go to ChatGPT, and that's sort of my way of thinking about it. The way I look for recipes, the way I find out my fitness routine, everything is through AI in that sense. So yes, AI is very, very pervasive. And literally yesterday, we had a panel discussion at Cube Crash, which is another event, a virtual event, where we talked about what does AI mean for platform engineering. So in that sense, AI is definitely impacting anything and everything. And when you think about AI and open source, a couple of elements that come to mind is, first is sort of the LLMs themselves, right? There is OpenAI, Anthropic, sort of the big models of the foundation models over there. And then there are, of course, open source models like, Mistral or others. Meta has Llama, or even OpenAI released ChatGPT OSS 20B or 120B. NVIDIA is releasing more of open source models. I think everybody in that sense going into that game. So yes, and it's not an open source model, it's an open weight model. So there's a bit of a flexibility and a customization over there. So that's the way to think about it. The other way to think about this is, as you are building an open source project, what tools are you using? Are you using tools like Cursor, Lovable, Replit, which are closed source, by the way? It's basically a fork of VS Code, and then with a Claude backend or whatever you want to use. Or you're using open source tools like Klein or RuCode, which are open source fork, and they have an enterprise model. So I think, again, open source is very prevalent over there. The other way to think about this is, if you are maintaining an open source project, what does it mean for you to accept the code generated by LLM, right? Because now, I was reading a statistics, Warp. Warp is another terminal-based project that allows you to do code completion, code generation, etc. And they were saying in the first week, their developers across the Warp community generate 150 million plus lines of code.
All right.
with 97% acceptance rate. Well, what is the technical debt for that code now, right? So that is something we need to be really, really careful about. what are the guardrails that are put into place? What are the security elements that are put into place? What kind of policy audits we are doing for such code being put into production?
Mm.
You know, without warp, and I would love to see that data without warp, what was that number of lines of code? And with warp, if we're generating 150 million plus of lines of code, we're not going to see the impact right now, but a year, two out, what that's going to look like, what the open source project is going to look like. So I'm frankly seeing AI babysitters. So
Mm.
what they do is really they look at the code that is generated by AI, and the productivity goes high, but then it introduces so many bugs because it's just going all over random. Then you have to start cleaning up. So the productivity gain is lost by the frustration caused by it.
Yeah.
On LinkedIn, I was reading an article. There are there are folks whose title is Vibe Code Cleanup Specialist.
That's right. I saw that one as well, and that became a big thing now, and it's because it's needed.
Right. So I think that's where we have to think about it. That if that much code is going to get generated, if that's going to get that code is going to come to maintainers, and the maintainer is going to see a higher velocity coming in. But are they now AI babysitters, or are they truly seeing the genuine code, or somebody who's vibe coding a project? How much of the code do they understand? They say, yeah, it's mostly working. Go. And then we'll let the maintainer figure it out. So I think, does it increase the burden on the maintainer is a part that needs to be seen. So I think there are lots of interesting dynamics, and this is changing rapidly. Literally every week, every other week, every month, something new is happening. So I'm definitely keeping a close eye on this. I think that's where I want to shout out to tools like JetBrains. I mean, that's an amazing tool, really. They have embraced AI really well, but there is a toy AI kind of capability, which you can generate a bunch of, MVP code, but putting it into production is really hard. And then there is professional AI categories. I think that's where I would love to see some energy being put.
Mm. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. So we can pick up this conversation later in a couple of months and see where we are at that point. As you said, things are changing a lot. But yeah, it's I guess it's this balance between higher productivity versus quality, because it doesn't necessarily mean that we get the quality that this productivity brings. So at the end of the day, we may not actually be more productive, but we may spend more time fixing things from the bad code. But
and I think really a discussion or a panel on that in a couple of months or in a quarter would be really great. That could be a really exciting discussion. That what are the productivity gains you're seeing? Is it really vibe coding? Is it AI assisted coding, or is it professional AI coding? What do you see over there? I mean, all these tools, the AI tools that I'm seeing, they're saying, oh, we do better on this SWE benchmark. Who cares? That's my use case. Do you operate on that or not? That's all I care about. So I think that would be a really great discussion.
Making a note on that. I think, yeah, and I know a couple of names come to my mind who may want to join that discussion. So okay, that sounds like a plan. So just sort of wrapping up now, if you could leave business leaders and developers that are actually hands-on working with open source technologies within their companies, if you can leave them with one takeaway from your book, what would it be?
Yeah, I would say for both of them is a bit different, right? For the developers, actually, very similar, as a matter of fact. The last chapter of the book talks about a culture change framework. It gives you sort of the 10-step process on what you could do if you want to bring an open source cultural change. And I would say there are 40 plus case studies in the book by 55 plus authors. I would say go through the table of content, see which one you align with the most, and maybe pick a couple of case studies, read that and see, aha, this is what they did, and this is sort of my industry, and I can connect with this. That's great. But then you want to take the first step. So this would be this would be more on the middle management to senior management to read through that culture change framework. Like, how do you find an executive sponsor, somebody at the executive level who's willing to champion the cause? That is super critical, right? Then who are the stakeholders? If you are at a company where their core product is closed source, no intention of going open source, it's okay, you don't have to. carve out the area where that is not company's core business. So infrastructure is very commodity, unless you are in the business of infrastructure, but infrastructure is otherwise very commodity. So identify those areas where you can start making those changes. Have those listening sessions from the developers. What would they like to contribute to open source? Create those internal open source working groups where you just meet and discuss and bring people together. Develop the contribution guidelines, work with your OSPO or the legal team, have that discussion, define what your public speaking policy is. So lots of things that you can do, really. My biggest advice, though, is be very, very patient. These things, if you are part of a larger ship, it takes a long time to move that ship. I've done that a few times actually, and it takes at least a couple of years. So everything that I did at a company 2-3 years ago is showing the results after that. So you just got to be very gritty about it, very perseverant about it, and eventually it'll show the results. And again, I'm happy to talk to any one of you for a specific case if you want to help, because that is something I'm very passionate about. That is something I've done multiple times at very large companies and small companies, and I advise a lot of startups as well. So if any one of you is looking for that kind of a guidance, I'm available.
Thank you. Thanks, Arun, and really appreciate you sharing that knowledge. So this book is definitely very useful for me, and I bookmarked some of the bits. I will definitely be coming back, and as you said, there's specific chapters or specific use cases and case studies that can be very useful depending on your business or on your specific example. And also, as you said, it's a long process, and it's about consistency and patience, and because it's a cultural shift. These things don't take a week or a month or even a year. It's a huge change, but it's a change worth doing, and it's great that you putting all of that information out there. You're putting all of those examples out there, speaking to those people that are sharing their experiences as well. So I definitely recommend anyone who wants to adopt open source culture in the company to read their book and take some wisdom from it. So thanks very much, Arun, and thank you for joining us for the podcast as well.
Thank you so much. Very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.